Hello, welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. It's Richie here, and I'm joined today by JM.
Hey everybody. It's been a long
Back
time,
together
Richie.
again. I
Yeah.
know, it has been a little while, hasn't it? It's nice to be back together again now. It's 2 episodes in a row. Feels like we're back to old times.
Yeah, I hope
But
so.
yeah, well, it's still, we say old times, like everything's changing every day at the moment with this bloody virus.
Yeah, it's had a big effect on work and life and the publishing industry in general. Although entertainment is kind of one of the things that's surviving pretty well. You know, when people are stuck in their homes, they either need something to watch or something to read. So
Yeah, well, book sales have been on the up, haven't they? I think, call it the year of the book. Will it last, though? That's
amongst
the
other
thing.
things.
Once everyone escapes their homes again, will they still
But
be reading? That's the big question.
what book are you referring to? The Necronomicon?
Yeah.
So
But yeah,
what have you been up to the past month or so?
I haven't really been doing too much. I've been doing the last edit of upcoming novel Pariah's Laments. So just be reading that, to be honest, because when I finished drafting that, I took a bit of a sabbatical from writing for maybe 2 or 3 months, and it just completely lost me confidence in my ability to write. And I was like, I just don't feel like I can write anymore. I need to get back into it. So when I was going through that, rereading it, I sort of got my confidence back in a way. I sort of, I was like, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
I love
So
that. I love that feeling because I'm revising Call of the Guardian for re-release, so I'm going through it and doing another round of proof edits. And I
yeah,
love going back to an old story that you haven't thought out for a long time, and especially seeing particular passages that are really good. And you're like, oh, I wrote that. Hey,
yeah, I know. It's really sort of reassuring. But big concern for me about this book is that only 2 other people have read it. So it's just what is the wider public gonna think? I think it's good, and I think it's a pretty enjoyable, engaging story and full of action. It's just
two
what other
two
people are gonna think now.
you'd be surprised. Two is not necessarily a small number. I know in the podcast before we've mentioned needing, get your book read by beta readers, get feedback. There's a lot of
Yeah,
people that just throw a book out there that's never been read. So two is a good number. I mean, you get too many and then things get confusing.
yeah. I'll tell you what, it's hard work finding people willing to read a novel, like beta read a novel.
Yeah, we might have to do an episode on that in the future.
Yeah, and one of our listeners actually sent me a message about that very subject, and she was asking about ways to get beta readers. So I think it is definitely a subject we will cover, and I think it's we can definitely explore other things like the 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 sort of power and the influence that working with other writers can have on your overall writing and your writing career. So we will be back to that subject. What about you, Jay? And what have you been up to?
I've been dealing with a lot of real world things. So I'm kind of also a writer in the real world. I'm working on 2, maybe 3 academic papers right now. One is pending publication at a journal. I'm waiting for a second round of edits.
Cool.
And the second article I just sent off last week, but I have a really good feeling because I've been in talk with the editor. So I have a really good feeling that it's going to get accepted. I just don't know what the edits for that one are going to look like. And
Yeah.
then because I'm an idiot, I've already got a third intellectual question in mind that I'm diving into now that is going to take up some time. I just can't help myself.
Yeah, it's not too bad though, academic writing. One of the reasons why I started writing in the first place is because in university I actually quite enjoyed writing essays. I think it was just having the task and like you were saying there, you've got to focus your mind on something, and critically analyze it. So you got to do research and try and force yourself to think outside the box, think of the angles that no one else has thought of before. It's pretty cool. And when I stopped writing essays in university, then when I finished, I was kind of missing the challenge of doing something. So I think maybe that's why I got into writing fiction.
Yeah.
But, yeah, good luck with them anyway. Sounds like you'll be busy.
Hopefully, I wrap it all up by the end of the year, and then can focus more on fiction again. Although I am trickling away a little bit by bit on stuff with the fiction writing and of metal magic and whatnot. I figured we'd take it a little bit easy today. I saw in my Facebook feed some news that Time magazine had pushed out a top 100 fantasy books of all time list. And I figured we'd just talk about that and talk about the books on the list and the books we like, and just the idea of these top 100 lists and what they mean and what they really are used for. I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, most definitely.
So just to dive right in, if if the listeners aren't aware, I think it was a week or two ago, it was October of this year, Time magazine came out with their list of top 100 fantasy books of all time. And they've described the quote unquote process that they used to decide the books on the list. And by that, I mean, they didn't really describe what they did very well. Other than that, they have a list of published authors as part of the panel in conjunction with the Time magazine staff. And the published authors include Neil Gaiman, George R.R. Martin, Marlon James, and a few others. And then they went through a limited pool of books, and they ranked the top 100 that they liked best. And I think the most interesting thing is the way that they described fantasy and kind of what they were looking at. And so I'm just going to read directly from their page of their working concept. They said, "The world is stories. Why do we designate some people as heroes and others as villains? And why do we so loathe to change those designations when the people in question turn out to be just people? These are fraught times, but there have always been fraught times for someone in the world, somewhere. And though there have always been those whose mastery of the art of storytelling has helped us understand how powerfully stories shape the world. C.S. Lewis sought to comfort children with faith. Philip Pullman disturbed them with warnings of encroaching fascism. There's a preponderance of stories aimed at children on this list because we're still openly hungry for stories in the years of our childhood, and thus the stories we absorbed then have a lasting effect. Our hunger for stories doesn't really change when we grow up. However, the need is still there, acknowledged or not, especially if the stories we've been given up to that point don't accurately encapsulate reality. It is comforting to see how many of the stories on this list wrestle with the need to reform institutions and change the leadership of society. It could be. Yet the newer storytellers on the list, many of whom hail from colonized cultures and thus have vastly different backgrounds, stories from those of classic fantasy authors, also warn us of the realities of societal strife." So you can get just from that description that there is at least some political agenda here that they've come out with this in a time, fantasy books generally deal with struggle and the battle of good versus evil and whatnot, and they've framed this list that they've published and the need for fantasy as being especially relevant now. And then there's also a nod to expanding voices in the fantasy genre, which is a good thing, but it does frame the way that they've come about choosing books, I think.
Yeah, it seems like quite an interesting process that they've gone through. And when you look at the list, there's a lot of fantastic books on there, but at the same time, there are a lot of fantastic books that aren't on there as well.
The way the site describes it, the process is very opaque. They don't actually, they said that they have a point ranking system, but they don't actually say what the points are, and they don't give the points for each individual book. And then the other thing is they started with only 250 books. So they started with a pool of 250 books, which is nothing in the fantasy genre, and they narrowed that down to 100. So there's already some severe constraints placed on the books and the voting, and we just don't know how that came about. I think you have some thoughts about these lists and what they're really used for, don't you?
So whenever I see anything like Time Magazine doing a list like this, what is Time Magazine? At the end of the day, it's a marketing tool. Like, it sells ad space within its magazines. And if you look at, be interested, I haven't actually gone through and studied the publishing companies that own the rights to all these books, but I can imagine there's going to be a handful. And it just makes you wonder whether these lists have been put together by the publishers in sort of cooperation with Time to push their own books. Like, I know they've been quite transparent about the authors that they got involved, but I'm sure the authors were the ones who just shortlisted the 250. There was a lot of input from the Time editors. You know what I mean? Time editors who's really sort of making the decisions at the end of the day. Like, just like the American election, like you getting 300 million people or people voting in the election, but at the end of the day, it's the electoral college who decides, 538 people. So, you know what I mean? You don't really know what's going on behind closed doors, and the way the world is run these days.
Yeah.
Gluttonous consumerism.
I looked up some of the books. I looked at the Amazon pages for a bunch of the books, and who is identified as the publisher seems to range, but you know, the major publishing houses have tons of little imprints. So just because it says, Rabbit Foot Books doesn't mean it's an indie press. It probably, in this case, it's probably an imprint of a major publisher. The one thing that struck me is the layout of the Amazon pages all look the same.
Yeah.
Like they were made by the same guy. And I don't know if that's just them following trending off of each other and following a concept that works, or if they're all major publisher books and they've got a set format of how they do their Amazon pages. But it was striking to see that all the Amazon pages really look the same, especially like where all the review quotes are posted, and where it mentions it's in a Time 100 list and things like that. It was almost eerie. So I do think, word of caution for the listeners when you're approaching a list like this, that it could just be completely manufactured and just be a publishing tool. And even if this one isn't, it's very, very narrow in scope. Only 250 books were even considered of the probably tens of thousands of fantasy books that are out there now.
Yeah. And you're talking about the industry as well. It takes absolutely no account for self-published books.
Yeah, and then in addition to only being 250 books, multiple authors on the list are repeated more than once. There's two books by Ursula Le Guin. There's two books by Diana Winnie Jones. There's 2 or 3 books by J.K. Rowling. There's like 3 books by Neil Gaiman, who is one of the judges, didn't recuse himself. And then there's things like all the Lord of the Rings series. Each book is treated separately, whereas I would have categorized that as one book, since you can't have one without the other. They're non-severable in legal speak. And then there's 2 Alice in Wonderland books. So there's a lot of repeat that pushes out space for other authors, and other smaller publishers and whatnot.
Yeah.
So kind of moving to some of the book choices, there are some clear, at least in my mind, holes in the selection. So I'm not sure, without knowing what their grading score is and what their qualifications are and what they're using to judge, other than the kind of this concept they have of what they were looking for of being addressing dangers in the world and post-colonialism and whatnot. Things like Andrei Sapkowski's Witcher series, which is huge now and has spawned into video games and comic books and TV series. It's like one of the most well-known fantasy series is missing from the list.
Yeah. Most influential as well, if you think about it. It's like one of the main drivers of the fantasy genre.
Right, definitely right now, yeah.
Yeah.
And then R.A. Salvatore or Dungeons and Dragons.
Nothing on there.
The Tolkien inspired fantasy that we get, a lot of what you get now, even The Witcher, with elves and dwarves and all those foundations. Tolkien created it, but Dungeons and Dragons popularized it.
Yeah.
You can't have modern fantasy without Dungeons and Dragons. And then like R.A. Salvatore is the key author of those books. He's authored books, comics books, video games. Like, he's huge. So there's a lot of gaps of within the convention of what they've chosen to select. There's some obvious gaps of things that are at least popular and influential. You could argue about well written, but I think you can argue about a lot of the books on the list being not as well written as others.
Yeah, well, there's a few obvious ones, isn't there? There's definitely some books I think should be on there. Raymond E. Feist, the Reform Saga. There was like 16 books in that series, and that's maybe one of the most significant fantasy series ever. There's not one book from a series on there. I mean, Magician is absolutely superb. That's inspired me to write. It's inspired loads of people to write. I mean, it's just what these judges have decided the criteria should be. It's like they're talking about like how imaginative these books are, and they sort of demonstrate the possibilities of the genre. But what about the books that have defined the genre as well as sort of explored the scope? Like Feist for me defines fantasy. You know what I mean? Tolkien's on there, but The Hobbit's not on there. How many people, fantasy writers now, would you ask? I mean, did you read The Hobbit, and what impact did that have on you? They would all say it influenced them in some way.
If it was me, I would have done Lord of the Rings as one and The Hobbit as another.
Yeah, most definitely, because the Lord of the Rings was written as one story. It was just
they do different
divided
things.
into 3 books.
They serve different purposes. They have different target audiences.
Yeah, most definitely. But there are a lot of fantastic books on it, and I do like the way they've included some of, a lot of children's books, like a lot of Roald Dahl books, James and the Giant Peach. That is a fantastic story. You got The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis, Mary Poppins, all fantastic stories that sparked imaginations in a lot of people, a lot of famous writers today. What kind of book? What's some of your favorite books on this list so far?
So I was really surprised by Arabian Nights, which I think is a big one that should have been there. I was surprised. I was surprised by Terry Pratchett even being on the list. even though
Yeah.
Neil Gaiman is a judge, he's probably the one that put it there. I think the books on the list, the ones, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, I mean, in general, they're good picks. I just think the scope could have been a little bit longer, a little bit wider.
Yeah.
So speaking of which,
Yeah.
one of the reasons this stood out to me and I thought it would be a good topic to discuss is, what does this tell us about these, the judges and the Time magazine staff? Like, what does this tell us about their view of the genre? And the more that I thought about it, the more that I came to a conclusion that they have a kind of very narrow view compared to what my view is. There is some spread. So they have traditional fantasy like Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, King Arthur. But then they go back to older myth. So Arabian Nights. There's a book called Song of Achilles, which is a new book, but is based off of Greek myth. And then modern-ish fantasies like Mary Poppins and All Birds in the Sky, Good Omens. And then I don't know how you would define them, but like Alice in Wonderland and Watership Down. So these kind of fanciful with anthropomorphic characters and things like that. It's interesting that they include All Birds in the Sky, because not only is that very modern, half of the book is very sci-fi. I mean, and then the whole book is kind of focused on the conflict between technology and nature. But they don't include, what's missing is other modern books with fantasy elements that are subgenres. So like horror and gothic. So I'm thinking like Stephen King and It. I would consider It a fantasy book.
Yeah.
The monster elements of that book, the magic and whatnot, is there's a sci-fi-ish spin in how they explain the monster. But it's pretty fantasy. And then Stephen King also did the Dark Tower series, which is just straight up fantasy, and it was very, very popular. And then Anne Rice, who's pretty much solely responsible for the vampire revival. And vampires and vampire horror, gothic horror is purely fantasy. It's all made up. It seems like the list is a bit fixated on archetypes. So you have like Harry Potter series and All Birds in the Sky feature characters who are witches and wizards, traditional fantasy archetypes. But without looking at the themes of those books. So like All Birds in the Sky is very fixated on technology. It's more sci-fi than it is fantasy. And then there's a book by Salman Rushdie, which really surprised me, because Salman Rushdie is a very famous author. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. I don't think he would ever describe himself as a fantasy author. He writes.
He's actually came out and said he will refuse to describe himself as a fantasy
Exactly,
author.
right? He writes literature. He doesn't write fantasy. He's higher than that. So it's very interesting that that's on the list, because he doesn't consider himself fantasy. I would consider his books magical realism is fantasy. You can sugarcoat it, but it's fantasy.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with being a fantasy writer. Come on.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, right? Maybe they're calling him out. They're like, nope, you're fantasy. Live with it.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing I noted is there's 4 books on the list from 2018 to 2019 that have the title structure noun of X and Y. So like, Throne of Glass and Bone, or Daughter of Stars and Fire. That is such a huge cliche at this point. And I'm wondering, just looking at the dates, I'm wondering if that's kind of where that really peaked, is 2018. so many books now that use that format, noun of X and Y. And it just
Yeah,
shows that trends, marketing trends, even influence the choice of titles.
yeah. There's a lot of really, you talk about newer books. There's a lot of really good newer books in there, like Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James, excellent. A couple of books on there by Tomi Adeyemi, both very good. Yeah, there's a nice variety, if you will, but it's difficult to say that all of these books are within the top 100 best books ever. You know what I mean? It's just whenever you
Especially
do
without
one
a
of these
definition of
lists,
best.
yeah, it's just whenever you see, like, I mean, like the BFG by Roald Dahl is a fantastic book, but is it one of the best fantasy books of all time? What it's so subjective, you know what I mean? And you probably end up talking for hours and hours just debating what should be on here, what should be the criteria.
If we're thinking of influential children's fantasy books, BFG, yeah, I mean, I remember reading that as a kid. Why not Dr. Seuss? That's like
Yeah,
absolute fantasy and hugely influential.
yeah,
The other thing
exactly.
I wanted to ask you, because I know you like Joanne Abercrombie. Would you consider Joanne Abercrombie grimdark?
He's grimdark, I'd say. Yeah.
Did you see any books on the list that were grimdark? Because I
No.
didn't know any that jumped out to me as for books that I knew were grimdark. So that's like a whole subgenre that's missing from the list.
Yeah, and it's a
That's
really popular subgenre, like
and
last 5 years or
growing more and
so.
more every day. Yeah,
Yeah,
and seems to fits the scope of what they were looking for as being very um, politically aware and looking at power structures and the burden of the common man. So it's weird to
yeah. I
have
think,
no grimdark.
yeah. I mean, I dabbled with grimdark. I wouldn't say I'm a grimdark writer, but one of the good things about that genre and the sort of darker fantasies is that you do have the scope to explore the flaws of humanity in greater detail, because you're looking at the sort of extremes of things. You're looking at how evil can people be. Are people actually evil at all? They sort of living in the grey, if you get me, like the sort of the space between good and evil. And I think it's more accurate, it's more true to life, because no one's purely good, no one's purely evil. Everyone's sort of in that middle. And that's what them sort of subgenres, which have sort of sprouted up over the last few years and really pushed the boundaries of the genre, they should be sort of acknowledged, I think.
Yeah, I think for me as an author, uh, on the spectrum, I fall much closer to Noble Bright than I do Grimdark. I I like having, I like reading fantasy to get away from the grayness of the world, and I like having heroes that are heroic and I mean not necessarily villains that are evil, but
Yeah,
heroes that are noble and heroic and are trying to do the good thing, the right thing, is what I'm drawn for towards as a reader and a
yeah.
writer.
No, it's interesting. It's funny we're talking about this because it's actually Halloween today. Um, it's Halloween. I don't think it's Halloween anymore for you, is it? In South
Nope,
Korea,
that was last night.
that
I
was last night. So
did
I've still
the
got.
obligatory watch of Hocus Pocus.
I was talking to my girlfriend about this. Like a lot of the stories I write are darker. Um, not want to say horror as much, but they do tend to be darker. And I don't like watching horror films at all, or even really reading much horror. I just don't like it. But I write about it. I write stories in that sort of style. It's a really strange sort of juxtaposition.
I'm not a big horror fan, but I do love anti-heroes. So
Yeah,
like Taken, Liam
yeah.
Neeson is gonna go just kill everybody to get what he wants. But
Flat in
he's still the good
Paris.
guy. He's still the good guy.
Yeah, because someone kidnapped his daughter.
So
Yeah.
just generally looking at the list, any books that are there that you have significant comments about?
I think I'm looking at A Storm of Swords now by George R.R. Martin. Just seeing which one is this in the third. Yeah, this book I think inspired me to write. There's
What makes that the third one different than the first or the second one? Why does this one?
I think this is the one where it was the red wedding and things like that. So it was when the story really started to get going, and it was split into 2 parts. I think this book, because it was so big. And when I remember one evening, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't sleep. And I think I was up to the second part of this book, and I just started reading it. And then next time I checked the time, it was 7 a.m. And I've just been reading 6 hours non-stop. I hadn't even stopped to check time, stopped to fucking do anything apart from read the next word, you know what I mean? I could not stop reading this book. And no other book, no other writer has enraptured me that much. And it just inspired me. It's like, I wish I could do this for other people so they can enjoy stories like this as well. And I think that's when I've started to really seriously think about writing from that point onwards. Harry Potter as well. When I was 11, 12, that's when Harry Potter was the big thing. And I just remember getting each book and just curling up on my bed and just reading each one. And just absolutely loving it. Yeah, what about you? Have you got any standouts here?
So the one that surprised me was Redwall. So I remember reading Redwall and Martin the Warrior when I was a really young kid, and just the idea of the anthropomorphic characters, the mice and the rats and the moles and everything, and the underdog hero, right? So the hero or the heroes of those books are mice. Those had a big effect on me in just my imagination, expanding my imagination to places that it never would have gone before. I recently read Howl's Moving Castle, and it was very, very good. I liked it. One of the Neil Gaiman books on the list is Neverwhere, and I think it got me off on the wrong foot with Neil Gaiman, because he develops a really interesting world, but the main character is just completely flat. Has no real motivation or agency. He's just kind of flowing through. It's a portal fantasy, so the main character is transported to a different world, and he's kind of learning what the world is, but he just kind of goes with the flow and doesn't really do anything. So I found that rather disappointing on that end, and I really haven't approached another Neil Gaiman book ever since then.
Yeah.
Lastly, I think I was very happy that Terry Pratchett was on the list. I was just questioning why We Free Men is the book on the list. And I guess I kind of get it, because that's his one targeted to kids and teens, and it's probably sold a bit more and been a little bit more popular. But it's not representative of his masterwork, I don't think. The great thing about Terry Pratchett is you can read all of the Discworld books, and it's like you're reading a writer's journey, and you're watching him develop as a writer. The first books, all he really cared about was parody. It was just a bunch of jokes thrown into a book with a very loose plot, and it's about 15 or 20 books into the Discworld series where you get to the end of his transformation, where he's become a master, and he's really, really good with plots. Pratchett's characters, the Discworld characters, are all wonderful, but what he does best is plots, and You start a book and you'll get into the first few chapters and you'll have no idea where it's going. And then you get to the end of the book and then every piece has fit just absolutely perfectly. Everything
Yeah.
just comes together like a perfect tapestry. And the books that really do that best are his later watch novels. So like Thud is probably one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And the what or sometimes called the Industrial Revolution books, they focus on some function of society. So there's one that focuses on mail, and there's one focus on banks, and one that focuses on the the press, the media.
Yeah.
And it's weird that you could say, oh, it's a book, it's about, setting up the post office, but they have these very coherent and well developed plots, that I think you get. The We Free Men is um, focuses on his young character Tiffany, who's like a witch. Those books are very conventional and have a very straightforward fantasy structure, and they're not too surprising. It's the other books that have these plots that are very intricate and red herrings and other things that you don't really figure out what's going on and really get a sense of it until you get to the end, and then it just hits you like perfectly comes together. So it would have been better if I think they picked something like Thud or Monstrous Regiment, which is my favorite of the Pratchett books. Do you think any books on the list that you were like not sure about? So I wasn't. I'm not sold on Neverwhere. I'm sure. I think that was one of his earlier books. I'm sure Neil Gaiman has better books than Neverwhere. I'm not sure why that one. Maybe it's just popular, but we've already kind of talked about that. Popular doesn't seem to be the metric they're going for.
Yeah. I don't know. I say every book's probably justified in its own right, but there's other books there that I think should have been considered ahead of some of these ones. Like I made The Golden Compass by Pullman. I've read it. It's all right. Um, Again, it's just subjective. Someone might read that book and think it was amazing. So it's just all down to the people who are deciding, and that's
Yeah.
about it, really. We can talk to blue in the cheeks, but I don't think it's
So,
going to change.
is there any book that you've read recently that you know you really liked?
I'm really struggling with reading at the moment, to be honest. I'm um, very few books are just gripping me, and I'm one of them people. If a book doesn't grab me, I'm not going to carry on reading it. Force my way through it. The last book I tried to do that with was Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. I got about 300 pages in and just thought, this is awful. So,
I have the same
uh,
trouble. I think after becoming a writer, I'm a lot more critical than I was before.
yeah,
Just being a storyteller, I'm critical of movies too, but I read books and I'll get through a book, but I'll be like, oh god, that character was horrible, or this is a huge, this huge plot hole, or this whole section needed to be cut. Um, so finding a book that I really like is hard these days.
yeah. I'm just having a look at my bookshelf now. Uh, I think the last book that really gripped me was series of novellas by Michael Moorcock called Von Beck. I don't know if you've ever read them.
No.
They're very cool. The first one, let me get the the first one's called The Warhound and the World's Pain, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's like an epic fantasy crammed down into like a novella length. Um, Superb, definitely worth checking out. I think that was probably the last book that really gripped me. Um,
I might
Not
have to
much.
check that one out. One of the big problems I have with books right now is a lot of them feel like very bloated, and
Yeah,
it's just a matter of, I tend to be a more efficient writer, and I tend to favor less information versus more information. So
Yeah.
if it's a dense novella, I'd probably prefer a dense novella over a bloated novel.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are moving towards that kind of uh, preference for reading nowadays. It's like we don't have that much time anymore to enjoy like simple things like reading and watching television. We just want things quick and easily delivered. So it's tricky now for writers nowadays to know what we're doing is the right thing to do, especially if we're setting out to write a novel, because it took me 2 years to write Pariah's Lament, and it's a significant time commitment. You invest hundreds, if not thousands, of hours into it,
Yeah.
and at the end of it, you're just sort of apprehensive. It's like, well, I've just wasted 2 years of my life writing a book that nobody's going to like. I don't think you can really keep your sanity if you look at it like that, though. You've just got to just look back and think, I enjoyed writing that book and I'm proud of what I've done, and just focus on that more than anything else, just personal satisfaction, and
I
forget
think,
about what other people think.
yeah, I think primarily you need to write for yourself and write the story that you want to write. But I think it's
Yeah.
important to keep in mind certain market trends, especially if you're looking to publish and sell the book. I see on Facebook, fantasy books and Facebook all the time, people who are challenging, publishers and agents these days when you a debut fantasy book, they're looking for like 100,000 words.
Yeah.
And there's people that are on Facebook of like, I've got this 300,000 word epic
Who wants
that
the
I
beta
want to get
reader?
published, that I'm planning to write. I haven't even wrote it yet. And I'm planning it to be a 300,000 word epic instead of planning it to be something that's marketable. And it's just one, I can guarantee that if you're at 300,000 words, I could probably cut a third of that book off and not ruin the story. You've lost your gaze. You've lost your focus. Which is a problem with a lot of these big bulky epics, is that they tend to lose focus and they're just very bloated. And they, the other thing is a 300,000 word epic might be 3 books instead of 1 book. So that's the other consideration. So I think you kind of need to have some general guidelines going in that, 100,000 words is probably a good focus point for a fantasy novel these days. And, publishers and agents are looking for something that's a bit more focused, because you can tack on world building in other ways.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be just in the text of your book. There's a lot of, the internet age allows us to convey information a lot more broadly. So I think you write the book that you want, but you understand, you have some frame of reference of what the market wants.
Yeah. Very true. Definitely.
So any last comments before we wrap up our general discussion on fantasy books and Times Top 100? That's probably a marketing tool.
I'd like to hear what our listeners think about the list. What books do they think should be on there? What books do they think shouldn't be on there? So please, send us a message on Facebook, comment on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Are we not on Twitter? I can't remember now. We are on Twitter. We don't use Twitter.
Yeah.
We mostly use Facebook, but drop us an email as well, thefantasywriterstoolshed@gmail.com.
And I can
YouTube as
push
well.
out a link to the list on Facebook and on YouTube. And I think we might be able to add one to the description on the other podcast sites as well. And just start a discussion. What do you think of the books that are on the list? What books would you have if you have made a top 100 list of fantasy books, of all time? What books would you have put on the list that aren't there?
Yeah, most definitely. At the end of the day, it's subjective. We like what we like. Different books mean different things to us depending on what kind of place we're in at the time of our lives when we're reading it. I don't know, you might have been a lonely child and found a lot of company and escapism in Harry Potter, and those books will forever be your favorites no matter what. So yeah, books mean different things to everybody, so it's really hard to put these lists together, but it's always fascinating to hear why people choose books rather than just listing them, I think. Yeah, so yeah, thanks very much for listening today, everybody. I think it's been an interesting discussion.
Yep, and
Jail.
we'll have a more writing, publishing focus topic next time for you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be to do with marketing. Do you think?
Yeah, that'd be a good topic to look into.
Yeah, we've been focusing a lot on the marketing front lately, for reasons we won't reveal just yet. But yeah, thanks very much for listening. Please subscribe if you're listening to this for the first time. It's been great to have you join us, and please share with your friends, because that's why we do it, to help people and just to have a chat about fantasy writing. Which there aren't many podcasts that do this kind of thing. I was doing some research the other day and I couldn't find that many fantasy writing podcasts. So if you think that people you know would benefit from this, please tell them about it. And the more listeners we get, the more of these we'll do. And yeah.
Yep. Just like always, like, comment, share. We're always open for a discussion. And thanks for listening.
Yeah. Stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.